So we are going to continue this time with panel 2, which is Smart Cities, Infrastructure for Next Generation Communities. And we have a great lineup. We have another wonderful panel. And I just want to mention that, you know, smart cities, smart infrastructure, I mean, this involves a lot of technology, very leading edge kinds of thinking about, you know, building communities and the needs of communities. What does infrastructure mean, actually? It's very complicated if you think of the roads and the power grids and the buildings that we have. And there's a great deal of opportunity, I think, for technology transfer, for a lot of connection from America to the Middle East and building these kinds of partnerships that are needed in these populations that are growing. They have very youthful populations, and so there's a great deal of opportunity to meet those needs. So without further ado, I'd actually like to bring back onto the stage Bill Flanagan, who's going to moderate our next panel. Thanks, Bill.
All right, thank you, Simon. Great to be back with everybody. Hopefully you're all refreshed and got a little caffeine shot so you'll be able to keep up with this next panel. It really is exciting. Our panelists have a seat, really talking about new technologies and new communities. And I realize you're going to make a turn to healthcare this afternoon and talk a little bit about medical technology, but I couldn't resist, even before we get to our next panel, to just make note of today's Google Doodle. If you ever go to google.com and you see the doodle every day, today they're actually honoring Jonas Salk on his 100th birthday. And Jonas Salk, if you're not familiar, was of course the physician, the researcher who led the team that cured polio in the 1950s. Our guests from out of town may not realize that Salk's team was actually here at the University of Pittsburgh. And it was really Pittsburgh and that effort that ultimately led to the cure of polio, which has been all but exterminated worldwide. And it's such a great story because it really speaks to, I think, some of the things we're hearing, what we heard from Greg Reed, about the way that the University of Pittsburgh in particular, but universities here partner with the community, partner with industry, sort of a spirit of collaboration here that drives this kind of innovation. Because when Dr. Salk and his team came up with this vaccine, it was a desperate time in America, in the world. Every spring, parents dreaded the warm weather because it meant that polio would begin to make its rounds across the United States and their children could wind up paralyzed. So the early 1950s were just a terrifying time. And Jonas Salk and his team came up with this vaccine, but then the question was, how are they going to test it? How could they be sure it was safe and effective? So Jonas Salk tested it on himself and on his own children. And then he asked for volunteers from Pittsburgh, from the community, and said, do you want to help? Who's willing to put your own children on the line in an effort to understand whether this vaccine might ultimately eliminate polio for the entire world? And people here in the communities in Pittsburgh stepped up, and they took that risk, and ultimately they made it possible in the space of just a few years to come up with a vaccine that has all but eliminated polio around the world. It's a great story. So indeed, you know, happy birthday, Jonas Salk, one of our favorite native sons of Pittsburgh. And again, a real testament to the spirit of innovation, and that's what we're going to again talk about today. And really this time, with our next panel, this time really talking about communities and the way they're being revolutionized around the world. And in fact, what's going on in the Middle East may be pushing the edge of the envelope as much as anywhere. We're going to hear about some exciting stuff from Germany, some amazing things that are happening here in our region, and certainly what's happening in the Middle East. But it's all about understanding how people will want to live in the future, what are the best ways to sustain our communities and make sure that we can deliver a quality of life that everyone in the world will hopefully be able to enjoy. So we're very excited to have 3 more panelists to tackle this topic. Let's see, here immediately on my right is Giambattista Atzeni, who, as you'll know in your program, is Senior Director for Middle East, Africa, and Turkey with BNY Mellon International Wealth Management. Also next to him is Tariq Farwana, Founder and Managing Director of StrateSphere, the economic city projects of Saudi Arabia. He's also been a pioneer pioneer in a concept called active capital for about 20 years now. So we'll talk to you hopefully a little bit about what that's all about. And then Professor Volker Hartkopf from Carnegie Mellon University. He's a professor of architecture, but he's also the director of the Center for Building Performance and Diagnostics, and is really pushing the edge of the envelope, as I said, here in Pittsburgh, about how buildings can work, how they can be more efficient, not just good for energy, good for costs, but literally better places to work where people want to be. So hopefully they go to work more often and they don't call off sick as often. So a lot of advantages to really pushing the edge when it comes to these building technologies. But you know, you can have the big dreams, you know, you can have these grand visions of communities, you can have these wonderful buildings in your mind you can design, but at the end of the day, you know, you got to be able to pay for it. That means you need financing, that means you need to bring capital to bear. So Giambattista, I'm going to start with you. First off, how does BNY Mellon play in this space? And then we can talk a little bit about how you're seeing the availability of capital to do these big projects evolving in the Middle East.
Sure. So BNY Mellon has been present in the region since 1963. Our first office was opened in Beirut, and we still have the office there in Beirut, in Lebanon. Following to Beirut, then we opened up also in Cairo, Abu Dhabi, and more recently in 2008, we opened our regional branch and hub in Dubai. That's where I'm based. And in 2008, actually moved from BNY Mellon in London to Dubai to basically help setting up our presence there. BNY Mellon, although our first office was opened in 1963, has been doing business in the Middle East since 1908. Our first client was actually the Ottoman Bank under the Ottoman Empire. And by doing that, we were already obviously helping the region, addressing some of the needs and requirements. Back in 2008, however, to move quickly, fast forward. Back in 2008, when I moved to Dubai, the world was a different world. Bear Stearns issue took place in February 2008. Lehman Brothers didn't collapse yet. That was September 2008. So I moved to Dubai, and Dubai didn't have the financial crisis yet. The Middle East didn't have the credit crunch yet. And the Middle East was basically working along the lines of typical banking financing, and by accessing financing only through the banking sector, they exposed themselves to the mismatch of assets and liabilities. They were using banking finances to finance the long-term projects, some of the big projects we mentioned earlier in the previous panel. When the financial crisis took place, and that was pretty much in the Middle East in 2009, people have realized that basically the banks were not able to offer capital anymore. So we, as a BNY Mellon, were involved also in helping and educating the region in shifting from the typical banking financing to the capital market. And obviously that was a big shift because ultimately the governments and project sponsors need to engage with a different type of audience. Now they need to talk to international investors if they want to issue bonds or Islamic bonds, sukuk, to finance projects also in partnership with governments and the private sector. So we've been involved in establishing, first of all, yield curves for governments to basically provide a benchmark to the private sector. And in the old days, there were only a few names that were able to basically access international capital markets. But nowadays, you have a wide variety of different entities, government entities, utility companies, who are often also still linked to the government, and the private sector entities, they now are able to address their financing needs by engaging with international capital markets. So we even assist to some of very large debt capital market deals that have a very long tenors. We also have a 20-year type of bonds, and for emerging markets, that means investors are taking a fairly hefty bet on the sustainability of the issuer or borrower. So BNY Mellon, as I mentioned, so has been involved in basically helping the region in doing that. And obviously, as usually happens, the governments are the first ones to kickstart. And across the region, Egypt was already a fairly active player in the capital market space, but then we assisted to other countries, Turkey, and then the UAE. Within the UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai separately, Saudi Arabia to a lesser extent, and Qatar as well, were perhaps the most active players. So now the world has changed.
Yeah, is it more stable? Is capital flowing? Has it recovered from the bust 6 years ago?
Obviously, emerging markets are very quick in going down, but they also are much quicker in going up again when things get better. And certainly, this has been the case also with the financial crisis. The situation has definitely changed. Infrastructure issues and serious elements that created the Middle Eastern crisis on the credit crunch side have been addressed, not only with regards to the matching of the assets and liabilities, but also with regards to the clear understanding of what actually is guaranteed by the government and not guaranteed by the government, that allows the proper identification of the risk associated to the underlying project. The situation is obviously different. The Middle East is not one single country. It is obviously, it's a multipolar region. So when we talk about the Middle East is not one place only. I mean, the differences between the North Africa are already ginormous, between Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt. You move to the Levant, you have Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian authorities, and Israel. Down in the south, you have all the GCC countries. Across the water, you have Iran, and ultimately you also have Iraq somewhere there in the middle. All of these countries have a different reality, and they have different needs to address their geopolitical as well as the financial situation. The GCC perhaps has been the most stable region, and obviously things got better much quicker in the GCC. The situation is not yet up to speed for other parts of the Middle East. North Africa and the Levant perhaps hopefully will follow soon.
Fascinating stuff. Well, we can come back and maybe build on some of that a little later. But Tariq, got to ask you about the StrateSphere and the economic city projects. What's that all about? What are you working on?
Well, we're mostly focused on essentially looking at large-scale opportunities, if you will, to build within the region, mostly in the Gulf states, and hopefully as we expand into some other areas. But we're unilaterally focused on making sure that there is a sustainable model beyond the initial investment. And there's no shortage of investment, and you probably can attest to this in terms of infrastructure, technologies, equipment, resources. The real issue in the region is there has not been significant investment in terms of developing the right human capital that not only can manage and maintain what exists, but also sustain it and even drive back some of the innovation to those that bring those resources to the region. So
yeah, we talked about innovation in the first segment. So right now, it's that kind of innovation is being imported for the most part. You don't have the base there in the region itself. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's fascinating about the United States is what I call the freedom to create. We gotta have similar platforms in the Middle East where you empower the youth to really start creating and becoming creative and feedback. I think innovation is a multi-directional one. It has to be a bi-directional one. And as many of those that know a lot more than I do in terms of manufacturing, for you to be successful on a regional basis or even a local basis for that matter in some cases, you have to produce for the needs of the region or the local requirements. And you cannot do that without actually having product development, at least as a function, from within the region. And that's really what drives that innovation. That's why I'm kind of anxious and eager to see kind of the next generation of companies that end up going to the Middle East, thinking about how do you solve not only a problem that has existed for years in terms of unemployment and the lack and the disenfranchised youth, if you will. That's, as many of us know around the table here, it's a problem that's growing. 60% of the population of the region is younger than 30 years old.
60% is younger than 30 years old?
Yeah,
wow.
I mean, that's a problem. I mean, how do you engage them? How do you keep them involved in a productive manner and actually create this mindset of being a global citizen, that their job is not only to go to work and go back and be told what they need to do. No, actually be productive in terms of what is next.
Right.
How can you drive
engage
what's
them,
next?
help them, get them involved in solving these problems. I want to come back and talk a little bit about the millennials and how different they are, perhaps, maybe not around the world, but from their parents and grandparents. But I do want you to talk a little bit about your active capital business model. What's that all about? And how does that fit into what?
So we've, for the last 20 years, we've been focused in the United States. I mean, our business is a U.S.-based business in Columbus, Ohio, out of all places. So, but we are focused. The portfolio companies that we end up investing in, we tend to become essentially the back office for them, so that we can free them for innovation. So the entrepreneurs are focused more on what's the next generation of their product or service and how to best compete in a market that otherwise, they're going to be busy with all of the mundane stuff. And those short services have, span the gamut from, payroll, HR, supply chain, logistics, and free them to focus on how do they really create the best product or service. We call ourselves rainmakers and housekeepers. Housekeepers in the sense making sure that all of this back office is there, but rainmakers in the sense of creating and tapping in a network of opportunities for those portfolio companies locally as well as globally from that perspective.
So really engaged in the companies that you're investing in.
Yeah, so we're not, and we don't run the companies. We are actually more advisors and strategic thinkers with the companies, and it's their job, it's the entrepreneur's job to scale and grow the company within the strategic directions that we work with them on it. And we're trying to take this model to the Middle East, by which we again help create those companies that are led by the fresh thinking, by the millennials that you're probably going to be talking about what the changes are, and we see that change in place today.
Well, that's an idea. I want to make sure we touch on that, but why don't we go to Professor Hartkopf, who's on the cutting edge when you get down into actually how the buildings work, some of the technologies and innovations you're exploring at Carnegie Mellon. Why don't you first tell us a little bit about your lab there at Carnegie Mellon and what goes on, and then we can talk about what you think some of the potential may be worldwide from just building better.
Thank you. Well, I was very impressed this morning to hear that we should be humankind, not mankind.
Yes.
Humankind. And I think we need to be humankind also to nature, because it is the supporting environment. Nature is. And we must know that we consume in 1 year what took 1 million years to put in the ground. And that's no future. So I'm not against oil, I'm not against gas, I'm not against coal, I'm not against nuclear, but I'm for using energy effectively. And effectively is very different from efficient. Efficient is I can have an efficient light bulb, but if I use it during daytime when I could use daylight, it's ineffective. In America, when I need to go to Chicago, it's inefficient on one way, but it's also very ineffective because I have no choice over a rapid train. I have to fly or take a car or take a bus. So when you think about infrastructure and urban environments, we in 1974 started the first graduate program between architecture, engineering, and urban planning.
Well, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I was 16 then, so, okay. Anyway, the point is, we did this between the disciplines. And we've learned very quickly that we needed to do public-private partnerships. There's no way that the university by itself can do any of this. So we were also one of the first ones to do the first active passive house community redevelopment in Pittsburgh, a refugee camp improvement in Bangladesh, and earthquake-resistant housing and schools in Peru.
Wow, so already the global impact right out of the gate.
And so when we did this, we found that we can do things energy and environmentally effective and increase human health and safety, and also their relationship to each other.
I think we've got a little video clip that kind of illustrates where you work.
And now we did this also for the, let's say, environment of commercial buildings. And the problem is that so many of the economic important issues are in the economics externalities. For instance, in our region, you may know that we have about 14,000 additional deaths because of pollution from coal-fired electric power plants, particulates. And that's beyond the national average, 14,000. And that is obviously not a cost relationship to what we pay for electricity. And if I have a concern about Marcellus Shale, it's not necessarily that we have a resource, but that we now have it cheaper than it was in the past. And so now, for the next 10, 15 years, we can waste more energy instead of being energy effective.
Well, and that's one of the challenges, right? How do we keep our incentive to keep building smarter and more efficiently? So that's your office, right? At the Intelligent Building
Right,
lab,
and we consume 80% less energy to heat, cool, ventilate, and light that building. If you include in that equation our cogeneration system, which is a biodiesel cogeneration system with rejected heat utilization for steam and hot water. So you can see that you can do things dramatically more efficient and effective than we currently practice.
Well, so I get it. You can do it in a lab. You can do it there at the university. I think you have a good illustration, though, of an actual community in the world. I know we got a couple of pictures that's doing this for real with real people in a real town. There's a little bit more. We can go back to the slides of...
but anyway, so you can see how this is associated with modern technology in terms of iPhone regulating your building
that's
system.
How you're controlling the building. Oh, I see. She's regulating it with her iPhone.
So that you just lower your blinds, increase them in their, let's say, glare control, your lighting system, and it's all wireless, interconnected, smart technology.
So using these systems, you've knocked 80% out of the cost of operating that building?
It is 80% less energy.
80% less energy.
Right, and it has the highest air quality, the highest thermal quality, and the highest visual quality on campus. So it comes back to what we also need to do. We need to practice what we teach. And our own environments must show this. And when we did this project, it's net zero waste in terms of construction and no waste in relocation of people and equipment. And we then did several projects in China at universities and with the Ministry of Science and Technology, in France with Électricité de France, a laboratory for them, and we did things like this in Korea, North America, and Germany.
Okay, well, I want to come back and then pick up particularly one of those examples in Germany in a second. But I guess one of the questions I have is, and this is a really cool facility, got all the bells and whistles, they're controlling with an iPhone, and it's all this natural light, but you know, at the end of the day, do people want to live like that? And I think the big question we're asking here in our region these days especially is, you know, what does the millennial generation want? What kind of world do they want to live in? And how's it going to affect, you know, the decisions that the folks in charge now are going to make about how to plan and build this future? And I know, so you've been giving a lot of thought to this. You know, they want the same things everywhere in the world, do you think? How are they going to drive change and what we need to build going forward?
By the way, I'm not a millennial or Generation Y, unfortunately. I'm a Generation X, the previous one. But,
and you're the ones who are in short supply, because Generation X, especially here in the United States, there aren't enough of you.
It's good to know. And in the beginning, when I arrived in the morning, I didn't see a lot of young people. But then towards the end of the second of the previous panel, then I saw that they're all there on the back. I guess maybe they're students from the Carnegie Mellon University, or I don't know. But there are now quite a lot of millennials down there on the back that I'm sure they're going to be not only users of those future smart cities, but also developers of some of the solutions the smart cities will put into place. Honestly, the Middle East, the millennials in the Middle East are pretty much like the millennials everywhere else. They're IT savvy, so using any gizmos or iPhone or any other type of computer or technology to operate any activities. Definitely one of the things they do. They do use social network heavily. And obviously also some of the things that we saw in the Arab Spring, specifically in some of the Northern African countries and Egypt, they were very much driven by the millennials and the way of communicating among themselves with using Twitter and Facebook and any other type of device or social network. Obviously, the political and geopolitical element has been a driving force for and the millennials have been definitely involved in also reshaping the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. I believe, however, that beside that, so they find themselves in the forefront of these revolutions somehow. Beside that, you know, the millennials are like anywhere else, with a small exception, I believe. You know, the millennials in more mature and developed countries, they tend to be definitely less reliant on the use of cars, much more, you know, in tune and in line with what is the public transportation.
So they're willing to
walkable.
set the automobile aside. They don't care about it as much as
I mean, they
their
like to be in
parents
dense urban societies where you can walk from a place to another, basically. That's the typical millennial. In the Middle East, that may be the case for people in Cairo, for people in some of the other large cities. But in the GCC, it's not necessarily like that. So I think it's going to be very challenging to convince the millennials in the Gulf region to basically give up the use of their cars. Not only because of the weather, and you really need to move, but also because it's part of the culture. But beside that, really, the millennials are very much like any other place. One of the very interesting things is that, obviously, as you mentioned, specifically in the Middle East, the many countries, I think in Egypt in particular, which is a very large country, I think the 60% of the population is you know, below the age of 30. But this is a global phenomenon, and if we think that, you know, by 2020, 34% of the global population